Buonasera a tutti, oggi siamo qui con il professore Richard Schechner. Mr. Schechner, as about performance, how did your passion for this form of art begin? Is there a particular episode that led to it?
There's no particular episode. I was long interested in performance, but I do remember one thing. When I was a little bit younger than you, I was about 16 or 17, and my family had a home near the sea in New Jersey, which is a state next to New York. And in that town, not exactly in that town, but right behind that town, there was a theater called the Neptune Theater Circus. So it was inside a circus tent, and it was near the sea. That's why it was called Neptune. And they were doing Broadway musicals. They were doing plays like Carousel or Gypsy and these musicals. And I went up there and I saw what was going on. It was so attractive, really interesting to me. And that these younger people, they were older than I was, they were in their 20s, but they were still very young, were having such a good time. And I thought that this would be a really nice thing to do. So I volunteered to help them to work backstage, and I got to know these people. And it kind of, you get bit by a spider, and if you get bit the second time, that was the first bite, and that got me attracted. And then the second bite came when I was at university, about your age. I was at Cornell University, which is about 300 kilometers from New York City, and I was doing a lot of writing for the student newspaper, but I became the theater critic, so I would go to plays that would come to the university and write about them, and I enjoyed that a lot also. So those two things started me out quite young. It was some years later that I began to direct plays and I began to write plays, but those are the first two things.
You have been a revolutionary figure in the study of this discipline, creating performance studies according to which every action can be studied as a performance. How did this idea come about?
Well, nobody has an original idea. All of our ideas are kind of reconstructions and elaborations of ideas that are already out there. And, there's a famous statement that was made even last night when I was having dinner with the father of Dario Tomasello, and his father was a rector at the university, a very famous neurosurgeon, and he said, we all sit on the shoulders of giants. In other words, we move forward, but we depend on people who came before. So in terms of performance studies, the idea that one could look at everything in the world from a performance point of view. This interview that I'm doing, how they run their hotel, the music that we hear in the background, which is a kind of soothing or supposedly soothing thing for the hotel, how streets are organized, how people sell things, etc. Anything you want, you can examine as a performance. There was a man whose name was Irving Goffman, and in 1956 he wrote a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. That book was not published in the United States until 1959. Now that's a long time before any of you were born, but it was, I was at that point about 25 years old, and I read his book and The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, and the second chapter in that book was called Performances, and he talked in that book how everyday life was organized as performance. For example, he would discuss and analyze a dinner party, and he would say, if you have a dinner party and you have friends come over to share food for supper, the backstage area of that is like your bedroom where you're going to dress, or you're going to dress up. Like I noticed that you're dressed a little bit differently than your two colleagues over there because you obviously knew you were going to be on camera. So you have this very nice red and white shirt and your jeans and all. Not that they're not well dressed, but they're not dressed for camera. You're dressed for camera. You have your lipstick on, you've combed your hair and so on. So when we do a dinner party, one dresses a certain way. Also backstage would be the kitchen or wherever you're preparing the food. And then if you're having people over, especially if you don't know them so well, they're like an audience. You want to present the food right. You want to do it in a certain order. Maybe you want to serve some nuts and a little wine before, and then you eat, and so on and so forth. The whole thing unfolds as a performance. So Goffman would analyze that, and I thought that was very interesting. And then I began to expand on that idea, and I began to think about how sports are the same way, you know. So not only professional sports, which are obviously performances, they're on television, one watches them. I assume that you watch the World Cup, and people are very passionate about their sports. But these athletes are also, they are athletes, but they're performers, they're actors, their uniforms are their costumes, and you can tell the players because of the different colors of their costumes and their numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So I began to more and more think of how all different kinds of things could be considered performative, like as if they were performances. And then in the early 1970s, that's still a long time ago, I met Victor Turner, who was an anthropologist. He died in 1983, but for the last 6 or 7 years of his life, from 1976 to 1983, we were very close friends, and we worked a great deal together. And he wrote several books. One of them was called The Ritual Process, and he was talking about how rituals in our life are performances. What do I mean by rituals in our life? Well, there are different rituals that go around life changes. So, for example, you're all at university. At a certain point, you're going to graduate, and you'll have a ceremony. You'll have a ritual that will have nothing to do with your education. You won't learn anything, but it'll mark a turning point. It'll mark the time when you move from being a student to being not a student, to being something else, or maybe moving on to a graduate school, but that still is something else. And that ceremony will be important to you. And you'll also costume for it. You'll have your moment on stage when you get your diploma, or somehow you'll be recognized, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one rite of passage, but there are many, like a marriage is a rite of passage, a funeral is a rite of passage, a birth is a rite of, all of these things are rites of passage. And Turner analyzed these from a performance point of view. And then when he met me, we began to influence each other. And so I wrote a well-known essay called From Ritual to Theater and Back, how rituals give rise to theater, how theater gives rise to rituals, and back. And then he wrote a book called From Ritual to Theater. So he was obviously influenced by that. So these are other key giants upon whose shoulders I sit, and some people sit on my shoulders. So it's like you take ideas and you rework them, and you add something to them, and you pass them on. And that's the way science is done. Art is done somewhat differently. Science is fundamentally collaborative and experimental. Art is sometimes very individuated, and we want to know the personality and style of individual artists. If they're like a visual artist like Picasso or Caravaggio. I was just in the museum here at Messina today, and I saw some magnificent paintings by Caravaggio, and I had no idea that he lived in Messina for some time. And so that's individual kinds of things. Scientific experiment is a little bit different. But I wanted to introduce into the performance world the idea of experimentation, the idea of doing something that hadn't been done before, the idea of testing things. So my life has been between the academic stuff that you're talking about with performance studies, but I also have directed a number of plays. In fact, when I leave Messina tomorrow, after being honored here with an honorary doctorate, and I'm very pleased with that, I'll be going to the Biennale in Venice, and there I'll be meeting with some people that I worked with as artists, who were my colleagues and assistants, and doing plays. And a film of one of my plays will be shown at the Biennale, and so on. So that's another aspect of my life.
And is there something you wish for everyone who wants to follow the same-year path? And do you have any advice you'd like to share?
Well, advice is a bad thing. You go to doctors to get advice because you feel sick. So in a way, I don't like to give advice beyond basic life advice, which you all know. I mean, I feel that one should follow one's heart very strongly, that you should, insofar as you can, you should not do things that you really detest doing. You should do things that you love to do. You should try to find the intersection between what your family needs, what your society needs, what the world needs, and what you love doing. Where those two things meet, that's where you should spend your life. You shouldn't spend your life I don't believe in martyrdom. I don't think you should spend your life sacrificing it for others. But even martyrs, let's take somebody, well, she wasn't a martyr, but somebody like Mother Teresa, who spent her life helping the very, very poor and very, very sick, but she loved that work. It wasn't that she was forced to do that work. It was work that she wanted to do. So there's a huge range of things that people want to do. So you want to find that sweet spot where what you want to do and what needs to be done meet. So that would be my overall advice. What that would be particularly for you, for all of you out there, I have no idea. But you should, there's a Shakespearean phrase. Of course, Shakespeare wrote in English and he did not write in Italian, but he actually set a lot of his plays in Italy, didn't he? He set a lot of his plays in Venice and in Padua, because a lot of the stories that he dramatized were Italian stories from the Renaissance. At any rate, in Othello, one of his plays that was set in Venice, I believe, and it was about, it's interesting because this is a little sideline, but I'm here in Messina in Italy, and I realized that for 300 or 400 years, this was the emirate of Sicily. In other words, it was run by Islam, by people who were from the Middle East and North Africa. And then the Christians were here before, then the Muslims came, then the Christians came back. But it's been between the influences of Islam and the influences of Christianity, let's say the South and the East and the North and the West, they kind of meet here in Sicily. And at any rate, Othello is Islamic. He says he calls himself a circumcised dog. In other words, he was circumcised, which is a rite of Islam, which it shares with the Jews, and he was serving the people in Italy. At any rate, Iago, who is an enemy, also says a great thing that comes back to, you're asking me the question. He says, above all else, to thine own self be true. And so that's my advice also. Above all else, to your own self be true. But don't do it in a selfish way. Try to find how you can be true to yourself and do good for others.